I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, we're joined by former Newsday and New York Daily News reporter Robert Polner. He'll discuss his new biography of Paul O'Dwyer. Our first guest was appointed as a U.S. attorney by President Barack Obama in 2010. She was the first woman to hold that position in the Eastern District of Michigan. Given the January 6th attack on the Capitol, her oversight of public corruption cases, national security, and violent crime, Barbara McQuade now authors a new book, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. In it, she examines the rise of online misinformation and the real-world consequences that threaten the foundations of American democracy. She's now a professor of University of Michigan Law School and an opinion essayist for the New York Times. Barbara, welcome, and thank you for joining us. One of the things you say in the book is that the media is in part responsible for this because it's exaggerated its watchdog role. What do you mean by that, and how can we do a better job?
Oh, well, thanks so much, Sam. Thanks for having me. Well, I think, when we think about the media now has a lot of different hats. There is social media, there is the traditional news media, there is television media, radio, and cable news media. So those things are all very different. And I think they do perform an important watchdog role on society. But I think that today we have seen a couple of things. Some have become mouthpieces for individual candidates or parties. And that is a dangerous thing when we see a platform becoming used and exploited by people who want to use it for disinformation. But I think even some of the traditional media, the credible outlets that we look to for accurate news, kind of get caught up in a couple of things that are going on and have not quite adjusted to the new world. I think one thing is traditional journalists have grown up with the idea that you present both sides of a story. But that relies on the idea that there are two sides who are arguing in good faith based on a shared set of facts. If one side of the story is based on false claims, then I don't think that they get the same or deserving of the same recognition of those facts as good faith-based facts. And so I think that the media has kind of really struggled to figure out how to call a lie and how to debunk a myth. I think the other thing that the media has really struggled with is, do they allow themselves to amplify false claims, or do they ignore them altogether? And I think that, there are lots of examples. You can think about perhaps the attack of Nancy Pelosi's husband by an intruder with a hammer. And there were false statements pushed out online, some as jokes about the origin of that relationship, that there was somehow some inappropriate relationship with this intruder that led to this attack, based on zero facts, zero evidence whatsoever. And although it was first reported on social media, mainstream news outlets repeated that claim and gave it oxygen. And so I think that traditional media needs to kind of rethink its role in this world where everybody can be a publisher and people are publishing false things to allow themselves, not to allow themselves to become used to amplify those false claims.
So you would argue that against false equivalency, saying, well, Hunter Biden was convicted, so was Trump convicted, they're all crooks. You also point out that the New York Times was among the first to call out Trump as a liar, using that word. What more can we do, especially if you can argue that we're preaching to the converted and most people will believe only what they want to believe, their own version of the truth?
Yeah, I think that's a really dangerous thing. Certainly there are people who are misled by false claims, but I think one of the things that is so corrosive about our society today is that there are plenty of people who know better but are going along with the con. As you mentioned, this idea about everybody is corrupt. That is one of the strategies used in Vladimir Putin's Russia. The idea that everybody's a liar, there's no such thing as truth. Truth is for suckers, truth is for the naive. Everybody's corrupt, so you might as well go with the guy who will deliver you the most prosperity because everybody's a crook anyway. And I think that's a really dangerous form of thinking. I think that we need to have integrity in our legal system, in our political system, and in our government. And so, what can news organizations do? I think they have to have long looks in the mirror about what it is they're putting on their pages. I think we live in an era of clickbait and sensational headlines. And I know newspapers are struggling to get readers. And so, sometimes in an effort to sell stories, we'll double down on that which gets the most clicks, whether it's Hillary Clinton's emails or Hunter Biden's laptop. But when those claims get repeated, they get locked into the national consciousness. One of the great strategies that Hitler talked about, even in Mein Kampf, is the value of repetition. If people see things enough, headlines, they don't need to worry about the details. They just know that, Hillary Clinton did something bad and that's bad enough, or Hunter Biden's laptop. People can't even tell you what that means. They just know that it's something nefarious that somehow makes Joe Biden unqualified to be president. And so I think all news organizations need to re-examine the way they do business in this new world so that they're not being exploited and utilized by people who want to use them as puppets to parrot these false claims.
You talk about the authoritarian playbook. Are you sort of equating what the Trump people are doing with what authoritarian people have done? Hitler, Mussolini, Putin?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know that the end goal is to completely control society, but I think that they use some of the same techniques to gain power. And so, one of the techniques that Hitler used was declinism, talking about society as if everything is going downhill, cities in ruins, American carnage. That was one of the same tropes that Hitler used to gain power in Germany, the idea of the shame of the German people. Because if everybody believes that everything is bad, then extreme times call for extreme measures. It also allows someone to point to scapegoats as the cause of the problem. For Hitler, of course, it was Jewish people. Now it's, immigrants, or it's the LGBTQ community, or it's Black and brown people, DEI movements, whoever it is. They're to blame for all of this awfulness that's going on in our country. And in fact, certainly we have our problems, but by every objective measure, America's doing great. Unemployment is down, crime is down, the Dow Jones stock numbers are way up, off the charts, infant mortality is down, college enrollment is up. We're doing so many things great, and instead of leaning into this as a moment of great opportunity, instead all we hear is doom and gloom, because that is one of those strategies. Another is to undermine the press and the courts and the government bureaucracy as the deep state. The idea that critics are not to be believed is very important, because if you can undermine the credibility of critics, then when they inevitably criticize you, then you can say, see, I told you all along they lack legitimacy. So I think some of those very same techniques are being used today. The idea that the press is the enemy of the people, when I believe the press is one of the most important watchdogs we have in society.
Barbara, how many times can the press, the New York Times for one, say that Trump has lied without those stories becoming biased rather than analytical?
Well, I think you don't, but lying is a conclusion. And I think all conclusions require evidence to support it and a source of attribution for that evidence. When I was a prosecutor and I went into court, I couldn't just say stuff or make stuff up. I couldn't just say this person is a liar. I had to demonstrate why that was a lie. I had to show what the facts were and what the person said that contradicted the facts. I had to show the source for my facts so that the jury could believe why those were the accurate facts and what the other person was saying was in fact not true. So I think it requires diligence and analysis, as you say. But in the end, I think it's important to call out the lie and reach that inevitable conclusion when the evidence supports it.
You say we're living in the worst political divisions in America since the Civil War. How worried are you about a Trump second term? Aren't you somewhat confident that the other institutions of government, the military, the judiciary, Congress itself, will somehow put a clamp on whatever the administration might want to do?
Well, I'm actually very worried about it. In the first Trump administration, we had a lot of people there who put the brakes on things, who pushed back, and our institutions held for the most part, although certainly we had some challenges even then. But this time around, there is this Project 2025 And I think Donald Trump has learned a lot with the first go around. One is to put loyalists in office and not people who might say no to him. I think that one of the things he said is he loves acting officials as opposed to Senate confirmed cabinet officials. He can use a series of acting officials, one after the other, without getting them confirmed by the Senate, which would allow him to put anybody he wants in some of those places. He's talking about using the Justice Department for revenge prosecutions. I mean, that's just not how it's supposed to work. But I suppose if you grease the system at every point along the way, you can really disrupt those institutions that are supposed to check abuses of power. I worry about the use of the military beyond what is considered appropriate in this country. I worry about replacing our civil service of scientists and doctors and other professionals who do things like protect the power grid or our nuclear arsenal with one of the things that Trump has said he will do, which is to impose Schedule F, allowing him to make political appointments instead of career professional appointments. So I think that there are a lot of dangers afoot that could present themselves in a second Trump presidency that could really render our country unrecognizable.
Barbara McQuade, guest opinion essayist of the New York Times and author of the book Attack from Within: How Disinformation Is Sabotaging America. Thanks for joining us, and coming up next, a biography of Paul O'Dwyer. My next guest is an American author, journalist who has written extensively on social justice and civil rights for Newsday and the New York Daily News. With Michael Tubbety, Robert Polner has now written a new biography, An Irish Passion for Justice: The Life of Rebel New York Attorney Paul O'Dwyer. Emigrating to Brooklyn from Ireland, O'Dwyer has come to exemplify the liberal and multi-ethnic politics of mid-century New York. Robert Polner, also known for his work, The Man Who Saved New York, You Carry in the Great Fiscal Crisis of 1975. He wrote that with former New York State Senator Seymour Lackman. Robert, let me ask you, Paul O'Dwyer, whether you liked him or not, whether you thought he was too radical or not, was something of a conscience of New York. He was a battler for underdogs. Did he win more than he lost?
Actually, he probably lost more than he won. You're right. He came out of revolutionary Ireland as a boy, as an adolescent, and that shaped his views. When he showed up here in New York in 1925, 4 of his brothers were already here, and one of them, Bill O'Dwyer, would become, of course, the mayor of New York following World War II. But Paul, a Democrat, believed in defending the underdog. He had a great sense of justice and a great offense against injustice. And he carried that with him throughout his campaigns. He did not win many of his political campaigns, but he wasn't just a politician. He was a discrimination lawyer, and he was welcomed into social movements of all kinds, whether for voting rights or labor or ultimately against the Vietnam War and, of course, civil rights. Paul was a fighter on many fronts.
We wouldn't say that he was mellower as time went on, but how did he reconcile compromise versus confrontation?
Paul, I would say, had a stubborn streak. He wasn't always right, but never wrong, was part of his personality. And that both drew people to him, and some people took offense. He was more left and more radical than many of his Irish contemporaries in America. Didn't stop him, and his refusal to compromise with, for example, the leaders of the Democratic Party when he ran for various offices in New York probably hurt more than they helped.
It certainly didn't get him elected, except as council president.
Right. His first successful election was for a position that no longer exists, which was Manhattan councilman at large, and that got his feet wet with City Hall. and also returned the O'Dwyer flag to City Hall. His brother Bill had left, really been ushered out of City Hall in his second term amid a police scandal that he seemed to not stand in the way of, but maybe furthered along with his statements. And Paul is a great defender, very loyal to his brother, but returns in 1973, as you said, Sam, to be the city council president. And in that position, he had some power because he was on the now defunct Board of Estimate, sitting with the mayor and the other citywide elected and county officials.
Rob, you say that defending Mayor Bill O'Dwyer was a lost cause. Was he a crook? Was he corrupt?
Bill had a certain amount of notoriety around him. He was a New Deal liberal coming after LaGuardia. He was responsible for bringing housing to returning veterans from World War II, for putting the lid on a smallpox epidemic with an early example, much followed, of public health response. He was a kind of an accommodationist, a transitional figure in the way that Paul was, his younger brother was not. Paul was to the left of him. They argued a lot. There were occasions when Paul would walk out of the room if on his brother. But Paul was a loyal sibling, one of 10 children. Bill had helped him a great deal. Bill was never found guilty of anything. And so to say he was a crook, I think, would be unfounded.
When you talk about what Paul O'Dwyer accomplished, one of my favorite things was he changed the date on the city flag, the city seal. It was 1664 when the British took over. Paul O'Dwyer stuck it to the British by changing the date to 1625 when the Dutch settled in Manhattan. What else did he actually accomplish, would you say?
As a city council president?
Yeah.
One of the things...
I mean, assuming you could accomplish anything as a city council president.
Right. There was the famous line from Henry Stern later on that it was not even a rubber stamp, because at least a rubber stamp leaves an impression. But he did create the Ombudsman Office, a citywide Ombudsman Office centered in the City Council President's office at the time, which investigated complaints from ordinary citizens who didn't have heat in the winter or were upset about one aspect or another of the city bureaucracy. And there was not a great deal of faith in the city government at the time, I would say. So he created this, and it kind of was a forerunner of the New York City Public Advocate.
You had access to oral histories. You interviewed a lot of people for this book, An Irish Passion for Justice. What did you learn about him that you didn't know before?
I learned about him that he brought the lens of someone who grew up during the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War, and saw the depredations of the Black and Tans, a military outfit of the British, and took that with him, as many people did who had fought the British, who were Irish, who came to America, took that as a cue to be an activist for the marginalized and for those he feel were being oppressed.
And not just the Irish.
And not just the Irish by any extent, Sam, and I think that's a good point. He said when he went early to the Deep South to fight for voting rights and support African Americans who were trying to run for office in a kind of terroristic climate of the early 60s, he said that it was no different from County Mayo, where he was from. It was the Night Riders and the KKK were similar to what the climate he experienced as a boy. And that never left him. He was a man of the left consistently. But I think what was also surprising to me was there was an element of compromise and the necessity for compromise, particularly in politics, that arose as he addressed the question of Northern Ireland and the Troubles later in the last phases of his life. He even reached out to the Ulster Defense Association. It was a Protestant power military and a leader there named Andy Turee, which surprised me. He took a brief or white paper from someone who was essentially supported killing Catholics and distributed it among American Irish and political leaders he was constantly lobbying or in coalitions with, to say, we all have to compromise. We all have to come to the table. That wasn't something he did himself in various campaigns, including the most famously, I think, for him, the U.S. Senate race in 1968, when he was the insurgent Democratic Party candidate for Senate against Jacob Javits. But he did bring that to the Irish question.
He was an insurgent, challenged liberals like Bella Abzug, Ramsey Clark, and he also did not really support or embrace Hubert Humphrey when the alternative would have been was Richard Nixon. How did he justify that? How did he rationalize that?
I think he fought for voting rights and for people's right to run for office, and he wasn't about to give that up in his own case. And he believed firmly in the positions of the left, and I think he could be faulted for not throwing his support to Hubert Humphrey in that 1968 race earlier. He waited until really 2 days, as did Eugene McCarthy, the Dove challenger to Humphrey at the convention, to support Humphrey, to endorse him. And of course, Nixon went on to win. So as time went on, and in 1976, a lot of people questioned why he remained in the race against Bella Abzug, someone who agreed with him on most issues, and yet he did with Ramsey Clark and others. He was someone who tried to balance being in social movements, politics, and at heart was a lawyer, a discrimination lawyer, who did a tremendous amount of pro bono civil rights work. But I don't think he really ever fully explained what in retrospect seemed like poor judgment.
Was he a foolish, passionate man, as Yeats would say?
I think that some of that was attributed to him by his colleagues who were active with him on various movements, and particularly on the question of Ireland. He never gave up, and very late in life, he brought Bill Clinton to a pre-New York primary debate 2 days before the primary in 1992, along with his son Brian and other activists and politicians, and got him to commit to a whole number of steps on the troubles in Northern Ireland, including bringing, if he elected, bringing a U.S. envoy to the table and allowing Jerry Adams of the IRA to come to New York.
Which Clinton delivered on.
And Clinton did deliver on, not as fast as Paul would have liked, but nevertheless, that was a major achievement, and a lot of that was attributable to Paul and his persistence.
How would he have fared today?
I think he would have been quite dismayed by the tenor of American politics today, the racial backlash that the Trump years brought after the Obama years, the kind of schoolyard epithets used to advance one's campaigns. I think he would have been scratching his head at that, because he came out of an era that had a lot more decorum in politics, at least publicly. And he favored persistence over apathy, and he rarely, I don't think ever engaged in character assassination, and that wasn't the style of politics. But I don't think, Sam, he would have been daunted. He would have continued to fight for the issues that he believed in, which were to help the marginalized, particularly with economic uplift and labor, and to stand up for civil rights and voting rights.
Thanks to Robert Polner, his book, An Irish Passion for Justice, biography of Paul O'Dwyer. And coming up next, my thoughts on a big break for New York Democrats. 2 years ago, greedy New York Democrats overreached in carving up new congressional districts. The courts voided their gerrymander. Instead, judges named a nonpartisan mapmaker whose less partisan reapportionment cost the Democrats 3 seats. Those 3 seats were enough for Republicans to win back control of the House of Representatives. This time, the Democrats exercised more self-control in congressional redistricting. And they were rewarded with two decisions that, perhaps while they flout democracy, may help them regain a House majority in November. It's not rocket science that the outcome of the presidential and congressional races depends on turnout. In this election year, when nobody seems satisfied, a big variable will be which side can galvanize its supporters most effectively. Polls show that President Biden leads among the most reliable voters, those who bothered to cast their ballots in the primaries. So for New York Democrats, that means suppress Republican turnout. Governor Hochul may have done just that last week. She killed congestion pricing. Suburbanites hated having to pay $15 to drive into Manhattan. The toll would have given Republican candidates a potent weapon against their Democratic rivals for Congress and the state legislature. Hochul got the Democrats off the hook. Whatever the implications for Washington, she virtually deprived suburban and upstate Republicans of a symbolic battle cry. Meanwhile, a state appeals court weaponized a referendum that's bound to rally supporters of abortion rights specifically and liberals generally. Reversing a lower court decision, the judges restored to the November ballot an equal rights amendment. It would bar discrimination based on gender identity and pregnancy outcomes. An upstate judge had voided the referendum because Democrats, who constitute a majority in the legislature, slipped up and approved the language of the amendment without getting an okay from the Attorney General first. The appellate panel ignored that oversight, but invoked a different one, that the plaintiff's challenge had been filed after the 4-month statute of limitations. Both breaks for the Democrats say a lot about how democracy works in Albany. Majority rule still counts for something, but in a crunch, political expediency and legal technicalities take precedence. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.